They told me it was just community standards. A harmless policy meant to keep the neighborhood looking perfect. But rules don't feel harmless when they're twisted into weapons. What started as a simple disagreement quickly became a campaign to humiliate me in front of my own neighbors. And the person leading it all? Karen, our HOA president who believed her word was law. I thought it was just about control. I was wrong. It was about something much bigger and much darker. For the most part, life in our neighborhood was peaceful. I had bought my house with the dream of finally settling into a quiet, predictable routine. Morning coffee on the porch, the sound of kids riding bikes down the street, and weekend barbecues with neighbors who waved as they passed. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like home. I kept my yard tidy, paid my dues on time, and never caused a stir. To me, that was the unspoken promise of living here. Stay respectful, and you'll be left alone. For a while, that promise held true. But then I started noticing something strange. Karen, the HOA president, seemed to linger a little too long when walking past my house, her eyes scanning every inch like she was looking for a flaw. At first, I brushed it off as nothing. After all, she was known for being hands-on about neighborhood rules. Still, there was an unease I couldn't shake. The sense that she wasn't just looking at my house, but at me. And then, one morning, I opened my mailbox and found a letter. A notice of violation. That single piece of paper was the first thread pulled in what would unravel everything. I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. But it was only the beginning. At first, the violation notice didn't feel like a big deal. According to the Awad letter, the paint on my shutters was fading and needed immediate attention. I walked outside, stood in the driveway, and stared up at them. Sure, maybe they weren't showroom fresh, but faded? Hardly. They looked just fine. Still, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe Karen was just doing her job. Maybe this was just routine. But a week later, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This time, it claimed my garbage cans were visible from the street, even though I'd kept them tucked neatly along the side of my house, just like everyone else on the block. I knew then it wasn't random. It was targeted. The fines started small. $50 here, $75 there. But the wording of the letters grew sharper, more hostile. Failure to comply will result in further disciplinary action. Disciplinary action. It was the kind of language that made you feel like a child being scolded, not a homeowner paying good money to live in peace. I wasn't the only one who noticed Karen's behavior. Neighbors whispered about how she had it out for me. Some offered sympathetic glances when they saw me collecting yet another envelope from the mailbox, but no one dared speak up. Everyone knew Karen ruled the HOA with an iron fist. One afternoon, I was out trimming my hedges when I caught her standing on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. She just scribbled something down, eyes fixed, on my property like she was documenting evidence for a crime. "Afternoon?" I called out, forcing a polite tone. She didn't even look up. "You'll be hearing from us soon," she said flatly, before walking away. And she was right. The next morning, another notice arrived, this one accusing me of having unauthorized modifications to my backyard fence. The so-called modification? A section I'd repaired months earlier after a storm knocked it down. By now, the fines had ballooned to hundreds of dollars. I called the HOA office, demanded to speak with someone reasonable, but every time, I was stonewalled. "These are board-approved violations," the receptionist would say. "You'll need to bring your property into compliance." Compliance. That word echoed in my head. This wasn't about shutters or garbage cans or fences. This was about control. I decided to fight back. I gathered photos of my property, proof that everything was in order, and showed up at the next HOA meeting. The room was filled with neatly dressed board members, Karen seated at the head like a queen on her throne. When my turn came to speak, I laid out my evidence calmly. I showed them pictures, dates, even testimonies from neighbors. For a moment, I thought reason might prevail. Karen leaned forward, a thin smile curling at the corners of her mouth. "We appreciate your concern," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But the board has already voted. The violations stand." The gavel struck, and just like that, my entire presentation was dismissed. My neighbors avoided my eyes as I left the meeting, my face burning with humiliation. But the harassment didn't stop there. It escalated. One evening, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. "Final warning, non-compliance will result in legal action. Legal action." They were threatening to sue me over shutters, trash cans, and a fence. The stress was unbearable. I lost sleep, lying awake at night replaying every word Karen had said, every letter I'd received. My home, my safe haven, felt like a prison under constant surveillance. I began to dread the sound of the mailbox creaking open, knowing what would be waiting inside. And then, things took a darker turn. One morning, I walked outside to find my mailbox door hanging open, papers scattered across the lawn. At first, I thought it was kids playing a prank, until I noticed the violation notice wasn't just left inside. It was nailed to my mailbox with a rusty nail driven straight through the paper. That wasn't official HOA procedure. That was personal. Reported it to the HOA, demanded answers. They claimed they had no knowledge of it. But I knew better. The nail, the symbolism, it had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I felt trapped. If I paid the fines, I'd be admitting guilt I didn't deserve. If I ignored them, they'd take me to court. Either way, Karen had the upper hand. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules at all. This was about power, intimidation, and making an example out of me. The more I resisted, the harder she pushed. And soon, the fight between me and Karen would reach a point where neither of us could back down. I thought I'd already seen the worst of it. But the real battle, the one that would decide everything, was still ahead. The tension reached its breaking point on the night of the special HOA hearing. Karen had called it herself, claiming it was to resolve outstanding violations. In reality, it felt like a trial, me against the entire board. The room was packed. Neighbors filled the folding chairs, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Some avoided looking at me altogether, afraid of what it might mean if they were seen taking my side. Karen sat at the head table, her gavel resting beside her hand like a weapon she couldn't wait to use. She looked at me with that same smug smile she'd worn since the very beginning. I carried a folder stuffed with every notice, every fine, every photo I had taken to prove my innocence. My palms were sweaty, my throat dry, but my determination was stronger than my nerves. When they called my name, I stood. My voice trembled at first, but then the words began to flow. I laid everything out. How the violations were baseless, how the fines had been unfair, how Karen herself had crossed the line with intimidation. I held up the notice nailed to my mailbox and let it slam against the table for everyone to see. "This isn't about rules," I said, my voice sharp now. "This is about power, about harassment, about one person abusing her position to bully a homeowner who refuses to bow down." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. For the first time, I saw cracks in the board members' carefully rehearsed stares. Some looked uncomfortable. A few even looked ashamed. Karen, however, didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her smile widening. "If you can't follow the rules," she said slowly, savoring each word, "then maybe you shouldn't live here at all." Gasps filled the room. It wasn't just a threat. It was an eviction disguised as policy. In that moment, the anger that had been simmering inside me finally boiled over. I slammed my folder shut. "You don't get to decide who belongs here," I said. "This is my home, and I won't let you take it away from me." The room was electric. Neighbors who had stayed silent for months suddenly shifted in their seats. A few nodded, small but unmistakable signs of support. Karen saw it too. The tide was turning, even if only slightly. Her face hardened, and she struck the gavel down. "This meeting is over," she barked, but her voice wasn't as steady as it had been. For the first time, she sounded rattled. I walked out with my heart pounding. My body was trembling with a mix of fury and relief. I hadn't won, not yet, but I had stood my ground. And everyone in that room had seen Karen for what she really was. That was the turning point, the moment when the battle shifted from silence and fear to something else entirely. Because from that night forward, it wasn't just me fighting Karen. The neighborhood had started to wake up, and Karen's iron grip on the HOA was beginning to crack. I thought the worst was behind me, but the resolution, the fallout of everything that night set into motion, would prove even more shocking. In the weeks after that explosive meeting, things began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. At first, Karen doubled down. More letters, more fines, more threats of legal action. But something was different this time. Neighbors who once kept their distance started speaking up. One slipped me a note under my door. "She did the same thing to us. Don't back down." Another approached me in the driveway, glancing over his shoulder before whispering, "We're with you. She's gone too far." It was as if my stand had cracked open a door everyone else had been too afraid to touch. Suddenly, people weren't just talking about Karen's power. They were questioning it. Within a month, several neighbors petitioned for a special election to review the HOA board. Karen fought it tooth and nail, but the whispers had turned into voices, and the voices became a chorus. By the time the vote came, the outcome was inevitable. Karen was removed from her position. When the announcement was made, the neighborhood felt lighter, like a storm cloud had finally passed. The fines against me were dropped, the threats stopped. And for the first time in months, I could open my mailbox without my stomach twisting into knots. But the impact went deeper than just winning against Karen. I realized how fragile the idea of community really is. On the surface, our neighborhood had looked perfect. Trimmed lawns, polished fences, smiling waves from across the street. But underneath, it had been ruled by fear. People obeyed not because they believed in the rules, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. And when someone finally challenged that system, the illusion cracked. The hardest part wasn't the fines or even the threats. It was the isolation. The way people averted their eyes, the way silence became a weapon sharper than any written notice. That's what power does when it's abused. It doesn't just punish you, it convinces everyone else to abandon you. But here's the truth I learned. Standing up, even when you're alone, can change everything. It only takes one voice to break the silence. One act of defiance to show others they don't have to live in fear. I still live in that house. I still sit on my porch with coffee in the mornings, and I still hear the kids riding their bikes down the street. But I see it all. Differently now, my home isn't just walls and a yard. It's a place worth fighting for. And the next time someone tries to strip that away, whether through rules, intimidation, or outright abuse of power, I know exactly what I'll do. Because in the end, this story wasn't just about me and Karen. It was about every homeowner who's ever felt powerless against a system that was supposed to protect them. So I'll leave you with this. When the people meant to protect your community turn into the ones destroying it, will you stay silent? Or will you stand up?